Classics in Audiobook presents The Life of Tiberius by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. Part 1. Tiberius was the first of Augustus's successors. The only surviving son of Augustus's wife Livia, Tiberius had only been preferred as the successor after the death of Augustus's grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Suetonius presents Tiberius as a ruler whose long demonstrated competence in military and administrative spheres was progressively overshadowed by his withdrawal from political life and his reliance on imperial machinery. The life narrates his distinguished service under Augustus, his succession, the early exercise of consolidated powers, and the legal and fiscal management that characterized much of his administration. Suetonius also details the shift in Tiberius's behavior in the later reign, seclusion, delegation to freedmen and agents, and the prevalence of trials and informers, which altered the tenor of imperial governance. The biography juxtaposes institutional achievements with reports of private moroseness and political suspicion, thereby constructing an interpretive link between disposition and governance that explains the contraction of public trust and the increasing role of extrajudicial procedures under his rule. The patrician family of the Claudii, for there was a plebeian family of the same name, no way inferior to the other either in power or dignity, came originally from Regilli, a town of the Sabines. They removed thence to Rome soon after the building of the city, with a great body of their dependents, under Titus Tatius, who reigned jointly with Romulus in the kingdom, or, perhaps, what is related upon better authority, under Atta Claudius, the head of the family, who was admitted by the Senate into the patrician order 6 years after the expulsion of the Tarquins. They likewise received from the state lands beyond the Anio for their followers, and a burying place for themselves near the capital. After this period, in process of time, the family had the honor of 28 consulships, 5 dictatorships, 7 censorships, 7 triumphs, and 2 ovations. Their descendants were distinguished by various praenomina and cognomina, but rejected by common consent the praenomen of Lucius, when, of the 2 races who bore it, one individual had been convicted of robbery and another of murder. Amongst other cognomina, they assumed that of Nero, which in the Sabine language signifies strong and valiant. It appears from record that many of the Claudii have performed signal services to the state, as well as committed acts of delinquency. To mention the most remarkable only, Appius Secus dissuaded the Senate from agreeing to an alliance with Pyrrhus, as prejudicial to the Republic. Claudius Candex first passed the Straits of Sicily with a fleet, and drove the Carthaginians out of the island. Claudius Nero cut off Hasdrubal with a vast army upon his arrival in Italy from Spain, before he could form a junction with his brother Hannibal. On the other hand, Claudius Appius Regilinus, one of the Decemvirs, made a violent attempt to have a free virgin, of whom he was enamored, adjudged a slave, which caused the people to secede a second time from the Senate. Claudius Drusus erected a statue of himself wearing a crown at Appii Forum, and endeavored, by means of his dependents, to make himself master of Italy. Claudius Pulcher, when, off the coast of Sicily, the pullets used for taking augury would not eat, in contempt of the omen threw them overboard, as if they should drink at least, if they would not eat, and then engaging the enemy, was routed. After his defeat, when he was ordered by the Senate to name a dictator, making a sort of jest of the public disaster, he named Glicias, his apparitor. The women of this family, likewise, exhibited characters equally opposed to each other. For both the Claudias belonged to it, she, who, when the ship freighted with things sacred to the Idaean mother of the gods, stuck fast in the shallows of the Tiber, got it off, by praying to the goddess with a loud voice, "Follow me, if I am chaste," and she also, who, contrary to the usual practice in the case of women, was brought to trial by the people for treason, because, when her litter was stopped by a great crowd in the streets, she openly exclaimed, "I wish my brother Pulcher was alive now, to lose another fleet, that Rome might be less thronged." Besides, it is well known that all the Claudii, except Publius Claudius, who, to effect the banishment of Cicero, procured himself to be adopted by a plebeian, and one younger than himself, were always of the patrician party, as well as great sticklers for the honor and power of that order, and so violent and obstinate in their opposition to the plebeians, that not one of them, even in the case of a trial for life by the people, would ever condescend to put on mourning, according to custom, or make any supplication to them for favor, and some of them in their contests have even proceeded to lay hands on the tribunes of the people. A Vestal Virgin likewise of the family, when her brother was resolved to have the honor of a triumph contrary to the will of the people, mounted the chariot with him, and attended him into the Capitol, that it might not be lawful for any of the tribunes to interfere and forbid it. From this family Tiberius Caesar is descended, indeed both by the father and mother's side, by the former from Tiberius Nero, and by the latter from Appius Pulcher, who were both sons of Appius Secus. He likewise belonged to the family of the Livii, by the adoption of his mother's grandfather into it, which family, although plebeian, made a distinguished figure, having had the honor of 8 consulships, 2 censorships, 3 triumphs, 1 dictatorship, and the office of master of the horse, and was famous for eminent men, particularly Salinator and the Drusi. Salinator, in his censorship, branded all the tribes, for their inconstancy in having made him consul a second time, as well as censor, although they had condemned him to a heavy fine after his first consulship. Drusus procured for himself and his posterity a new surname, by killing in single combat Drusus, the enemy's chief. He is likewise said to have recovered, when propraetor in the province of Gaul, the gold which was formerly given to the Senones, at the siege of the capital, and had not, as is reported, been forced from them by Camillus, his great-great-grandson, who, for his extraordinary services against the Gracchi, was styled the patron of the Senate, left a son, who, while plotting in a sedition of the same description, was treacherously murdered by the opposite party. But the father of Tiberius Caesar, being quaestor to Gaius Caesar, and commander of his fleet in the war of Alexandria, contributed greatly to its success. He was therefore made one of the high priests in the room of Publius Scipio, and was sent to settle some colonies in Gaul, and amongst the rest, those of Narbonne and Arles. After the assassination of Caesar, however, when the rest of the senators, for fear of public disturbances, were for having the affair buried in oblivion, he proposed a resolution for rewarding those who had killed the tyrant. Having filled the office of praetor, and at the end of the year a disturbance breaking out amongst the triumviri, he kept the badges of his office beyond the legal time, and following Lucius Antonius the consul, brother of the triumvir, to Perugia, though the rest submitted, yet he himself continued firm to the party, and escaped first to Praeneste, and then to Naples, whence, having in vain invited the slaves to liberty, he fled over to Sicily. But resenting his not being immediately admitted into the presence of Sextus Pompey, and being also prohibited the use of the fasces, he went over into Achaia to Mark Antony, with whom, upon a reconciliation soon after brought about amongst the several contending parties, he returned to Rome, and, at the request of Augustus, gave up to him his wife Livia Drusilla, although she was then big with child, and had before borne him a son. He died not long after, leaving behind him 2 sons, Tiberius and Drusus Nero. Some have imagined that Tiberius was born at Fundi, but there is only this trifling foundation for the conjecture that his mother's grandmother was a Fundi, and that the image of good fortune was, by a decree of the Senate, erected in a public place in that town. But according to the greatest number of writers, and those too of the best authority, he was born at Rome, in the Palatine quarter, upon the 16th of the calends of December, the 16th of November, when Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was second time consul, with Lucius Munatius Plancus, after the battle of Philippi, for so it is registered in the calendar and the public acts. According to some, however, he was born the preceding year, in the consulship of Hirtius and Pansa, and others say, in the year following, during the consulship of Servilius Esoricus and Antony. His infancy and childhood were spent in the midst of danger and trouble, for he accompanied his parents everywhere in their flight, and twice at Naples nearly betrayed them by his crying, when they were privately hastening to a ship, as the enemy rushed into the town. Once, when he was snatched from his nurse's breast, and again, from his mother's bosom, by some of the company, who on the sudden emergency wished to relieve the women of their burden. Being carried through Sicily and Achaia, and entrusted for some time to the care of the Lacedaemonians, who were under the protection of the Claudian family, upon his departure thence when travelling by night, he ran the hazard of his life, by a fire which, suddenly bursting out of a wood on all sides, surrounded the whole party so closely, that part of Livia's dress and hair was burnt. The presents which were made him by Pompeia, sister to Sextus Pompey, in Sicily, namely, a cloak, with a clasp, and bully of gold, are still in existence, and shown at Baiae to this day. After his return to the city, being adopted by Marcus Gallius, a senator, in his will, he took possession of the estate, but soon afterwards declined the use of his name, because Gallius had been of the party opposed to Augustus. When only 9 years of age, he pronounced a funeral oration in praise of his father upon the rostra, and afterwards, when he had nearly attained the age of manhood, he attended the chariot of Augustus, in his triumph for the victory at Actium, riding on the left-hand horse, whilst Marcellus, Octavia's son, rode that on the right. He likewise presided at the games celebrated on account of that victory, and in the Trojan games intermixed with the Circensian, he commanded a troop of the biggest boys. After assuming the manly habit, he spent his youth, and the rest of his life until he succeeded to the government, in the following manner. He gave the people an entertainment of gladiators, in memory of his father, and another for his grandfather Drusus, at different times and in different places. The first in the Forum, the second in the amphitheatre, some gladiators who had been honourably discharged, being induced to engage again, by a reward of 100,000 sesterces. He likewise exhibited public sports, at which he was not present himself. All these he performed with great magnificence, at the expense of his mother and father-in-law. He married Agrippina, the daughter of Marcus Agrippa, and granddaughter of Caecilius Atticus, a Roman knight, the same person to whom Cicero has addressed so many epistles. After having by her his son Drusus, he was obliged to part with her, though she retained his affection, and was again pregnant, to make way for marrying Augustus's daughter Julia. But this he did with extreme reluctance, for, besides having the warmest attachment to Agrippina, he was disgusted with the conduct of Julia, who had made indecent advances to him during the lifetime of her former husband, and that she was a woman of loose character, was the general opinion. At divorcing Agrippina he felt the deepest regret, and upon meeting her afterwards, he looked after her with eyes so passionately expressive of affection, that care was taken she should never again come in his sight. At first, however, he lived quietly and happily with Julia, but a rupture soon ensued, which became so violent, that after the loss of their son, the pledge of their union, who was born at Aquileia and died in infancy, he never would sleep with her more. He lost his brother Drusus in Germany, and brought his body to Rome, travelling all the way on foot before it. When he first applied himself to civil affairs, he defended the several causes of King Archelaus, the Trallians, and the Thessalians, before Augustus, who sat as judge at the trials. He addressed the Senate on behalf of the Laodiceans, the Thyatirians, and Chians, who had suffered greatly by an earthquake, and implored relief from Rome. He prosecuted Fannius Caepio, who had been engaged in a conspiracy with Varro Murena against Augustus, and procured sentence of condemnation against him. Amidst all this, he had besides to superintend 2 departments of the administration, that of supplying the city with corn, which was then very scarce, and that of clearing the houses of correction throughout Italy, the masters of which had fallen under the odious suspicion of seizing and keeping confined, not only travellers, but those whom the fear of being obliged to serve in the army had driven to seek refuge in such places. He made his first campaign, as a military tribune, in the Cantabrian War. Afterwards he led an army into the east, where he restored the kingdom of Armenia to Tigrons, and seated on a tribunal, put a crown upon his head. He likewise recovered from the Parthians the standards which they had taken from Crassus. He next governed, for nearly a year, the province of Gallia Comata, which was then in great disorder, on account of the incursions of the barbarians and the feuds of the chiefs. He afterwards commanded in the several wars against the Rhaetians, Vindolicians, Pannonians, and Germans. In the Rhaetian and Vindolician wars, he subdued the nations in the Alps, and in the Pannonian wars the Bruci and the Dalmatians. In the German war, he transplanted into Gaul 40,000 of the enemy who had submitted, and assigned them lands near the banks of the Rhine. For these actions, he entered the city with an ovation, but riding in a chariot, and is said by some to have been the first that ever was honoured with this distinction. He filled early the principal offices of state, and passed through the quaestorship, praetorship, and consulate almost successively. After some interval, He was chosen consul a second time, and held the tribunician authority during 5 years. Surrounded by all this prosperity, in the prime of life and in excellent health, he suddenly formed the resolution of withdrawing to a greater distance from Rome. It is uncertain whether this was the result of disgust for his wife, whom he neither durst accuse nor divorce, and the connection with whom became every day more intolerable, or to prevent that indifference towards him, which his constant residence in the city might produce, or in the hope of supporting and improving by absence his authority in the state, if the public should have occasion for his service. Some are of opinion that as Augustus's sons were now grown up to years of maturity, he voluntarily relinquished the possession he had long enjoyed of the second place in the government, as Agrippa had done before him, who, when M. Marcellus was advanced to public offices, retired to Mytilene, that he might not seem to stand in the way of his promotion, or in any respect lessen him by his presence. The same reason likewise Tiberius gave afterwards for his retirement, but his pretext at this time was, that he was satiated with honours, and desirous of being relieved from the fatigue of business, requesting therefore that he might have leave to withdraw. And neither the earnest entreaties of his mother, nor the complaint of his father-in-law made even in the Senate, that he was deserted by him, could prevail upon him to alter his resolution. Upon their persisting in the design of detaining him, he refused to take any sustenance for 4 days together. At last, having obtained permission, leaving his wife and son at Rome, he proceeded to Ostia, without exchanging a word with those who attended him, and having embraced but very few persons at parting. From Ostia, journeying along the coast of Campania, he halted a while on receiving intelligence of Augustus's being taken ill, but this giving rise to a rumour that he stayed with a view to something extraordinary, he sailed with the wind almost full against him, and arrived at Rhodes, having been struck with the pleasantness and healthiness of the island at the time of his landing there in his return from Armenia. Here contenting himself with a small house, and a villa not much larger, near the town, he led entirely a private life, taking his walk sometimes about the gymnasia, without any lictor or other attendant, and returning the civilities of the Greeks with almost as much complaisance as if he had been upon a level with them. One morning, in settling the course of his daily excursion, he happened to say that he should visit all the sick people in the town. This being not rightly understood by those about him, the sick were brought into a public portico, and ranged in order according to their several distempers. Being extremely embarrassed by this unexpected occurrence, he was for some time irresolute how he should act, but at last he determined to go round them all, and make an apology for the mistake even to the meanest amongst them, and such as were entirely unknown to him. One instance only is mentioned, in which he appeared to exercise his tribunician authority. Being a constant attendant upon the schools and lecture-rooms of the professors of the liberal arts, on occasion of a quarrel amongst the wrangling sophists, in which he interposed to reconcile them, some person took the liberty to abuse him as an intruder and partial in the affair. Upon this, withdrawing privately home, he suddenly returned attended by his officers, and summoning his accuser before his tribunal by a public crier, ordered him to be taken to prison. Afterwards he received tidings that his wife Julia had been condemned for her lewdness and adultery, and that a bill of divorce had been sent to her in his name by the authority of Augustus. Though he secretly rejoiced at this intelligence, he thought it incumbent upon him, in point of decency, to interpose in her behalf by frequent letters to Augustus, and to allow her to retain the presents which he had made her, notwithstanding the little regard she merited from him. When the period of his tribunician authority expired, declaring at last that he had no other object in his retirement than to avoid all suspicion of rivalship with Gaius and Lucius, he petitioned that, since he was now secure in that respect, as they were come to the age of manhood, and would easily maintain themselves in possession of the second place in the state, he might be permitted to visit his friends, whom he was very desirous of seeing. But his request was denied, and he was advised to lay aside all concern for his friends, whom he had been so eager to greet. He therefore continued at Rhodes much against his will, obtaining, with difficulty, through his mother, the title of Augustus's lieutenant, to cover his disgrace. He thenceforth lived, however, not only as a private person, but as one suspected and under apprehension, retiring into the interior of the country, and avoiding the visits of those who sailed that way, which were very frequent, for no one passed to take command of an army or the government of a province without touching at Rhodes. But there were fresh reasons for increased anxiety. For crossing over to Samos, on a visit to his stepson Gaius, who had been appointed governor of the East, he found him prepossessed against him by the insinuations of Marcus Lollius, his companion and director. He likewise fell under suspicion of sending by some centurions who had been promoted by himself, upon their return to the camp after a furlough, mysterious messages to several persons there, intended, apparently, to tamper with them for a revolt. This jealousy respecting his designs being intimated to him by Augustus, he begged repeatedly that some person of any of the three orders might be placed as a spy upon him in everything he either said or did. He laid aside likewise his usual exercises of riding and arms, and quitting the Roman habit, made use of the pallium and crepida. In this condition he continued almost 2 years, becoming daily an object of increasing contempt and odium, insomuch that the people of Nismes pulled down all the images and statues of him in their town, and upon mention being made of him at table one of the company said to Gaius, "I will sail over to Rhodes immediately, if you desire me, and bring you the head of the exile," for that was the appellation now given him. Thus alarmed not only by apprehensions, but real danger, he renewed his solicitations for leave to return, and, seconded by the most urgent supplications of his mother, he at last obtained his request, to which an accident somewhat contributed. Augustus had resolved to determine nothing in the affair, but with the consent of his eldest son. The latter was at that time out of humour with Marcus Lollius, and therefore easily disposed to be favourable to his father-in-law. Gaius thus acquiescing, he was recalled, but upon condition that he should take no concern whatever in the administration of affairs. He returned to Rome after an absence of nearly 8 years, with great and confident hopes of his future elevation, which he had entertained from his youth, in consequence of various prodigies and predictions. For Livia, when pregnant with him, being anxious to discover, by different modes of divination, whether her offspring would be a son, amongst others, took an egg from a hen that was sitting, and kept it warm with her own hands, and those of her maids, by turns, until a fine cock-chicken, with a large comb, was hatched. Scribonius, the astrologer, predicted great things of him when he was a mere child. "He will come in time," said the prophet, "to be even a king, but without the usual badge of royal dignity, the rule of the Caesars being as yet unknown." When he was making his first expedition, and leading his army through Macedonia into Syria, the altars which had been formerly consecrated at Philippi by the victorious legions blazed suddenly with spontaneous fires. Soon after, as he was marching to Illyricum, he stopped to consult the oracle of Geryon, near Padua, and having drawn a lot by which he was desired to throw golden thalli into the fountain of Aponus, for an answer to his inquiries, he did so, and the highest numbers came up. And those very thalli are still to be seen at the bottom of the fountain. A few days before his leaving Rhodes, an eagle, a bird never before seen in that island, perched on the top of his house. And the day before he received intelligence of the permission granted him to return, as he was changing his dress, his tunic appeared to be all on fire. He then likewise had a remarkable proof of the skill of Thrasyllus, the astrologer, whom, for his proficiency in philosophical researches, he had taken into his family. For, upon sight of the ship which brought the intelligence, he said, good news was coming, whereas everything going wrong before, and quite contrary to his predictions, Tiberius had intended that very moment, when they were walking together, to throw him into the sea, as an impostor, and one to whom he had too hastily entrusted his secrets. Upon his return to Rome, having introduced his son Drusus into the Forum, he immediately removed from Pompey's house, in the Carinae, to the gardens of Maecenas, on the Esquiline, and resigned himself entirely to his ease, performing only the common offices of civility in private life, without any preferment in the government. But Gaius and Lucius being both carried off in the space of 3 years, he was adopted by Augustus, along with their brother Agrippa, being obliged in the first place to adopt Germanicus, his brother's son. After his adoption, he never more acted as master of a family, nor exercised, in the smallest degree, the rights which he had lost by it. For he neither disposed of anything in the way of gift, nor manumitted a slave, nor so much as received any estate left him by will, nor any legacy, without reckoning it as a part of his peculium or property held under his father. From that day forward, Nothing was omitted that might contribute to the advancement of his grandeur, and much more, when, upon Agrippa being discarded and banished, it was evident that the hope of succession rested upon him alone. The tribunician authority was again conferred upon him for 5 years, and a commission given him to settle the affairs of Germany. The ambassadors of the Parthians, after having had an audience of Augustus, were ordered to apply to him likewise in his province. But on receiving intelligence of an insurrection in Illyricum, he went over to superintend the management of that new war, which proved the most serious of all the foreign wars since the Carthaginian. This he conducted during 3 years, with 15 legions and an equal number of auxiliary forces, under great difficulties and an extreme scarcity of corn. And though he was several times recalled, he nevertheless persisted, fearing lest an enemy so powerful and so near should fall upon the army in their retreat. This resolution was attended with good success, for he at last reduced to complete subjection all Illyricum, lying between Italy and the kingdom of Noricum, Thrace, Macedonia, the river Danube, and the Adriatic Gulf. The glory he acquired by these successes received an increase from the conjuncture in which they happened. For almost about that very time Quintilius Varus was cut off with 3 legions in Germany, and it was generally believed that the victorious Germans would have joined the Pannonians had not the war of Illyricum been previously concluded. A triumph, therefore, besides many other great honours, was decreed him. Some proposed that the surname of Pannonicus, others that of Invincible, and others of O Pius, should be conferred on him, but Augustus interposed, engaging for him that he would be satisfied with that to which he would succeed at his death. He postponed his triumph, because the state was at that time under great affliction for the disaster of Varus and his army. Nevertheless, he entered the city in a triumphal robe, crowned with laurel, and mounting a tribunal in the sceptre, sat with Augustus between the 2 consuls, whilst the Senate gave their attendance standing, whence, after he had saluted the people, he was attended by them in procession to the several temples. Next year he went again to Germany, where finding that the defeat of Varus was occasioned by the rashness and negligence of the commander, he thought proper to be guided in everything by the advice of a council of war, whereas, at other times, he used to follow the dictates of his own judgment, and considered himself alone as sufficiently qualified for the direction of affairs. He likewise used more cautions than usual. Having to pass the Rhine, he restricted the whole convoy within certain limits, and stationing himself on the bank of the river, would not suffer the wagons to cross the river, until he had searched them at the waterside, to see that they carried nothing but what was allowed or necessary. Beyond the Rhine, such was his way of living, that he took his meals sitting on the bare ground, and often passed the night without a tent, and his regular orders for the day, as well as those upon sudden emergencies, he gave in writing, with this injunction, that in case of any doubt as to the meaning of them, they should apply to him for satisfaction, even at any hour of the night.
He maintained the strictest discipline amongst the troops, reviving many old customs relative to punishing and degrading offenders, setting a mark of disgrace even upon the commander of a legion for sending a few soldiers with one of his freedmen across the river for the purpose of hunting. Though it was his desire to leave as little as possible in the power of fortune or accident, yet he always engaged the enemy with more confidence when, in his night watches, the lamp failed and went out of itself, trusting, as he said, in an omen which had never failed him and his ancestors in all their commands. But, in the midst of victory, he was very near being assassinated by some Bructerian, who, mixing with those about him, and being discovered by his trepidation, was put to the torture, and confessed his intended crime. After 2 years, he returned from Germany to the city, and celebrated the triumph which he had deferred, attended by his lieutenants, for whom he had procured the honour of triumphal ornaments. Before he turned to ascend the Capitol, he alighted from his chariot, and knelt before his father, who sat by, to superintend the solemnity. Bato, the Pannonian chief, he sent to Ravenna, loaded with rich presents, in gratitude for his having suffered him and his army to retire from a position in which he had so enclosed them that they were entirely at his mercy. He afterwards gave the people a dinner at 1,000 tables, besides 30 sesterces to each man. He likewise dedicated the Temple of Concord, and that of Castor and Pollux, which had been erected out of the spoils of the war, in his own and his brother's name. a law having been not long after carried by the consuls for his being appointed a colleague with Augustus in the administration of the provinces, and in taking the census. When that was finished he went into Illyricum. But being hastily recalled during his journey, he found Augustus alive indeed, but past all hopes of recovery, and was with him in private a whole day. I know, it is generally believed, that upon Tiberius's quitting the room, after their private conference, those who were in waiting overheard Augustus say, "Ah, unhappy Roman people, to be ground by the jaws of such a slow devourer." Nor am I ignorant of its being reported by some, that Augustus so openly and undisguisedly condemned the sourness of his temper, that sometimes, upon his coming in, he would break off any jocular conversation in which he was engaged, and that he was only prevailed upon by the importunity of his wife to adopt him, or actuated by the ambitious view of recommending his own memory from a comparison with such a successor. Yet I must hold to this opinion, that a prince so extremely circumspect and prudent as he was, did nothing rashly, especially in an affair of so great importance, but that, upon weighing the vices and virtues of Tiberius with each other, he judged the latter to preponderate, and this the rather since he swore publicly, in an assembly of the people, that he adopted him for the public good. Besides, in several of his letters, he extols him as a consummate general, and the only security of the Roman people. Of such declarations I subjoin the following instances. Farewell, my dear Tiberius, and may success attend you, whilst you are warring for me and the Muses. Farewell, my most dear, and, as I hope to prosper, most gallant man, and accomplished general. Again, the disposition of your summer quarters. In truth, my dear Tiberius, I do not think, that amidst so many difficulties, and with an army so little disposed for action, any one could have behaved more prudently than you have done. All those likewise who were with you, acknowledge that this verse is applicable to you. One man by vigilance restored the state. Whenever, he says, anything happens that requires more than ordinary consideration, or I am out of humour upon any occasion, I still, by Hercules, long for my dear Tiberius, and those lines of Homer frequently occur to my thoughts. Bold from his prudence, I could even aspire to dare with him the burning rage of fire. When I hear and read that you are much impaired by the continued fatigues you undergo, may the gods confound me if my whole frame does not tremble. So I beg you to spare yourself, lest, if we should hear of your being ill, the news prove fatal both to me and your mother, and the Roman people should be in peril for the safety of the empire. It matters nothing whether I be well or no, if you be not well. I pray heaven preserve you for us, and bless you with health both now and ever, if the gods have any regard for the Roman people. He did not make the death of Augustus public, until he had taken off young Agrippa. He was slain by a tribune who commanded his guard, upon reading a written order for that purpose, respecting which order it was then a doubt whether Augustus left it in his last moments to prevent any occasion of public disturbance after his decease, or Livia issued it in the name of Augustus, and whether with the knowledge of Tiberius or not. When the tribune came to inform him that he had executed his command, he replied, I commanded you no such thing, and you must answer for it to the Senate, avoiding, as it seems, the odium of the act for that time. And the affair was soon buried in silence. Having summoned the Senate to meet by virtue of his tribunician authority, and begun a mournful speech, he drew a deep sigh, as if unable to support himself under his affliction, and wishing that not his voice only, but his very breath of life, might fail him, gave his speech to his son Drusus to read. Augustus's will was then brought in, and read by a freedman, none of the witnesses to it being admitted, but such as were of the senatory in order, the rest owning their handwriting without doors. The will began thus, Since my ill fortune has deprived me of my 2 sons, Gaius and Lucius, let Tiberius Caesar be heir to 2/3 of my estate. These words countenanced the suspicion of those who were of opinion that Tiberius was appointed successor more out of necessity than choice, since Augustus could not refrain from prefacing his will in that manner.
Though he made no scruple to assume and exercise immediately the imperial authority, by giving orders that he should be attended by the guards, who were the security and badge of the supreme power, yet he affected, by a most impudent piece of acting, to refuse it for a long time, one while sharply reprehending his friends who entreated him to accept it, as little knowing what a monster the government was, another while keeping in suspense the Senate, when they implored him and threw themselves at his feet, by ambiguous answers, and a crafty kind of dissimulation, insomuch that some were out of patience, and one cried out, during the confusion, either let him accept it, or decline it at once, and a second told him to his face, others are slow to perform what they promise, but you are slow to promise what you actually perform. At last, as if forced to it, and complaining of the miserable and burdensome service imposed upon him, he accepted the government, not, however, without giving hopes of his resigning it some time or other. The exact words he used were these: "Until the time shall come, when you may think it reasonable to give some rest to my old age." The cause of his long demur was fear of the dangers which threatened him on all hands, insomuch that he said, "I have got a wolf by the ears." For a slave of Agrippa's, Clemens by name, had drawn together a considerable force to revenge his master's death. Lucius Scribonius Libo, a senator of the first distinction, was secretly fomenting a rebellion, and the troops both in Illyricum and Germany were mutinous. Both armies insisted upon high demands, particularly that their pay should be made equal to that of the Praetorian Guards. The army in Germany absolutely refused to acknowledge a prince who was not their own choice, and urged, with all possible importunity, Germanicus, who commanded them, to take the government on himself, though he obstinately refused it. It was Tiberius's apprehension from this quarter which made him request the Senate to assign him some part only in the administration, such as they should judge proper, since no man could be sufficient for the whole without one or more to assist him. He pretended likewise to be in a bad state of health, that Germanicus might the more patiently wait in hopes of speedily succeeding him, or at least of being admitted to be a colleague in the government. When the mutinies in the armies were suppressed, he got Clemens into his hands by stratagem. That he might not begin his reign by an act of severity, he did not call Libo to an account before the Senate until his second year, being content, in the meantime, with taking proper precautions for his own security. For upon Libo's attending a sacrifice amongst the high priests, instead of the usual knife, he ordered one of lead to be given him, and when he desired a private conference with him, he would not grant his request, but on condition that his son Drusus should be present, and as they walked together, he held him fast by the right hand, under the pretence of leaning upon him, until the conversation was over. When he was delivered from his apprehensions, his behavior at first was unassuming, and he did not carry himself much above the level of a private person, and of the many and great honours offered him, he accepted but few, and such as were very moderate. His birthday, which happened to fall at the time of the plebeian Circensian games, he with difficulty suffered to be honoured with the addition of only a single chariot, drawn by 2 horses. He forbade temples, flamines, or priests to be appointed for him, as likewise the erection of any statues or effigies for him, without his permission, and this he granted only on condition that they should not be placed amongst the images of the gods, but only amongst the ornaments of houses. He also interposed to prevent the Senate from swearing to maintain his acts, and the month of September from being called Tiberius, and October being named after Livia. The praenomen likewise of emperor, with the cognomen of father of his country, and a civic crown in the vestibule of his house, he would not accept. He never used the name of Augustus, although he inherited it, in any of his letters, excepting those addressed to kings and princes. Nor had he more than 3 consulships, one for a few days, another for 3 months, and a third, during his absence from the city, until the Ides, 15th of May. He had such an aversion to flattery, that he would never suffer any senator to approach his litter, as he passed the streets in it, either to pay him a civility, or upon business. And when a man of consular rank, in begging his pardon for some offence he had given him, attempted to fall at his feet, he started from him in such haste, that he stumbled and fell. If any compliment was paid him, either in conversation or a set speech, he would not scruple to interrupt and reprimand the party, and alter what he had said. Being once called Lord, by some person, he desired that he might no more be affronted in that manner. When another, to excite veneration, called his occupations sacred, and a third had expressed himself thus, "By your authority I have waited upon the Senate," he obliged them to change their phrases, in one of them adopting persuasion instead of authority, and in the other laborious instead of sacred. He remained unmoved at all the aspersions, scandalous reports, and lampoons which were spread against him or his relations, declaring, in a free state, both the tongue and the mind ought to be free. Upon the Senate's desiring that some notice might be taken of those offences, and the persons charged with them, he replied, "We have not so much time upon our hands that we ought to involve ourselves in more business. If you once make an opening for such proceedings, you will soon have nothing else to do. All private quarrels will be brought before you under that pretence." There is also on record another sentence used by him in the Senate, which is far from assuming, "If he speaks otherwise of me, I shall take care to behave in such a manner as to be able to give a good account both of my words and actions, and if he persists, I shall hate him in my turn." If you have enjoyed this audiobook, please consider supporting the channel in one or more of the following ways.